You are listening to PR Radio Station of America.
On a brisk Friday morning in Broadview, Illinois, the usually quiet suburb just west of Chicago woke to the sounds of drums and chants. Activists began arriving outside the ICE detention facility long before the sun reached its peak. The protest had been planned for days, spread through social media posts, flyers, and word of mouth. By the time morning traffic filled the nearby roads, the first 100 protesters were already there, many wrapped in scarves and holding handmade signs demanding an end to deportations. The crowd was diverse and deeply personal. Families brought photographs of loved ones detained inside ICE facilities. Young children stood with their parents, holding small posters that read, "Keep families together." Clergy members in robes and collars formed a silent circle at one corner of the site, while student groups led chants from megaphones. Political hopefuls mingled with longtime activists. Among them was Bushra Amawala, a young candidate for Congress, standing alongside community leaders. The presence of familiar public figures gave the gathering more weight. This was not just a neighborhood protest, but a political statement against a national policy. The chants grew louder with each minute. "No hate, no fear, immigrants are welcome here," echoed through the crowd. Volunteers handed out bottles of water, face masks, and goggles, preparing for the possibility of confrontation. Activist groups had learned from past protests in other cities. Tensions with federal officers could escalate quickly. A group of students carried a large banner painted in bold red letters, "Stop the raids now." Across the street, news crews from NBC5 Chicago set up cameras, capturing the building wave of energy. As the facility's morning operations began, vans lined up to exit the gates. Protesters immediately formed a human chain, locking arms and standing in front of the vehicles. The drivers honked repeatedly, but the crowd refused to move. Every horn blast only seemed to strengthen their resolve, drawing louder chants from the protesters. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders so they could see. A group of religious leaders stepped forward to join the blockade, their hands raised as if to bless the defiance. The protest was no longer symbolic. It was directly disrupting ICE operations. Inside Broadview's ICE facility, federal officers monitored the growing demonstration on security screens. Outside, tensions buzzed in the air. To protesters, this was an act of peaceful resistance, a way to shine a spotlight on what they saw as cruelty and injustice. To federal officers, it looked like a blockade meant to shut down enforcement. The stage was set for confrontation. Nobody yet knew how quickly this morning protest would spiral into chaos. But the signs were there. The chants were louder, the lines were tighter, and the nation's immigration fight had arrived in suburban Chicago. Inside the Broadview ICE facility, federal officers in camouflage uniforms and riot gear gathered in briefing rooms. Monitors showed live feeds of the protest outside, where demonstrators blocked vans from exiting the gates. Commanders ordered teams to suit up with helmets, shields, and canisters of tear gas. The plan was simple: clear the gates and restore control. But to the protesters outside, the sudden appearance of officers in military-style gear made the morning feel less like a civic demonstration and more like the start of a battlefield. As the gates opened, officers marched out in formation, shields raised. Protesters shouted louder, linking arms to block the vans still idling behind them. Chants of "We will not move" rose from the crowd. For a brief moment, there was a tense standoff, protesters standing their ground, officers waiting for them to disperse. But when the line refused to break, one officer raised his hand, signaling to deploy crowd control. Within seconds, the first tear gas canister was fired, landing with a metallic clink on the pavement. A white plume erupted, spreading across the protest line. People coughed violently, their eyes streaming. Parents grabbed children, trying to shield them with jackets. Clergy members who had been praying at the front dropped to their knees, choking on the acrid smoke. NBC5 Chicago's cameras caught every moment. Reporters shouted into microphones, their voices cracking as they described stinging eyes and burning throats. One journalist said she could barely breathe as the gas drifted toward the media trucks. Protesters scrambled in every direction, some rushing to rinse their faces with water, others trying to drag gas canisters away from the crowd. Yet even amid the chaos, many refused to leave. Bushra Amawala, the congressional candidate present at the site, was struck directly in the face with pepper spray. Through tears, she declared that federal agents had created chaos and had no justification for using such violence against peaceful demonstrators. Her statement, later repeated across news outlets, framed the protest not as a riot, but as a violation of democratic rights. More officers poured out of the facility, now in full gas masks, advancing on the protesters who staggered and coughed but continued chanting. The sound of canisters hitting the ground mixed with shouts, screams, and the steady rhythm of drums still beating defiantly. Each step the officers took forward symbolized not just a push against a crowd, but a deeper clash over immigration, law enforcement, and protest rights. What had begun as a peaceful blockade was now a violent confrontation unfolding live on camera, with the rest of the nation watching. Within minutes, the air outside the Broadview IC facility turned into a choking haze. Tear gas canisters hissed as they rolled across the pavement and into the grass where protesters had been sitting only moments before. People stumbled blindly, clutching their eyes, voices cracking as they gasped for air. Some knelt on the ground, coughing violently, while others tried to shield one another with makeshift bandanas soaked in water. The acrid smoke clung to everything: clothes, hair, even camera lenses, leaving behind a sting that would not fade quickly. Despite the panic, many demonstrators refused to back down. A group of students regrouped behind a banner, lifting it high even as their eyes watered. Religious leaders stayed close to the front lines, arms raised, chanting prayers between coughing fits. Parents rushed to push strollers out of the gas, while older children shouted back at officers through tears. Volunteers poured water over burning eyes and shouted instructions to newcomers. Stay calm, breathe slowly, don't rub your face. Amid the chaos, the sense of solidarity was palpable. While protesters described the scene as peaceful resistance met with excessive force, the Department of Homeland Security framed it differently. In an official statement, DHS said more than 100 rioters had surrounded the facility. According to their account, protesters assaulted law enforcement, slashed tires on government cars, trespassed on federal property, and hurled tear gas canisters back toward officers. The agency accused local police of refusing repeated calls for backup and labeled the demonstration an organized effort to obstruct federal immigration enforcement. Activists and witnesses pushed back hard against the DHS version. They insisted that the violence began only after federal officers used tear gas without warning. NBC5 Chicago footage showed protesters standing in a line, chanting, when the first canister was fired. Bushra Amawala and other public figures present testified that the crowd had been peaceful, with no weapons or acts of aggression. Instead, they described federal officers as the aggressors who escalated the situation deliberately to intimidate immigrant communities. The clash of narratives quickly spilled into news headlines and social media feeds. By midday, at least 3 protesters had been arrested. Officers in gas masks dragged them into waiting vans as the crowd shouted their names in solidarity. Others sat on the grass trembling, their faces red and swollen from chemical exposure. Some collapsed into the arms of volunteers, unable to stand after repeated gas exposure. The soundscape was surreal, chants mixing with coughs, camera shutters snapping alongside the sharp crack of more canisters being deployed. For Broadview's immigrant families, watching children cry and elders stumble, the moment was more than just a clash. It was a wound, symbolic of how the government treated their communities. As news of the Broadview confrontation spread, political leaders across Illinois and beyond rushed to respond. Governor J.B. Pritzker released a sharp statement condemning the use of chemical agents against demonstrators. He argued that peaceful protest was a protected right, and unleashing tear gas on families, clergy, and public officials was unacceptable in a democracy. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson echoed the criticism, saying federal officers had inflamed tensions rather than de-escalating them. Their words carried weight, fueling headlines that turned a local protest into a national flashpoint. Homeland Security officials quickly countered the criticism. Tricia McLaughlin, Assistant Secretary of DHS, accused Pritzker and Johnson of villainizing ICE officers and undermining the men and women who risked their lives to enforce federal law. DHS doubled down on its claim that the crowd at Broadview was not peaceful but organized rioters. They pointed to damaged vehicles and blocked entrances as proof. In their view, federal officers had responded with restraint to what they described as a dangerous mob. The stark contrast between the two narratives deepened public confusion and division. The Broadview clash did not exist in isolation. Across the United States, immigration enforcement had been intensifying under the Trump administration. Just a week earlier, an ICE officer fatally shot Silverio Villegas Gonzalez during a traffic stop near Chicago. DHS claimed Gonzalez had dragged an officer with his car, while his family and state officials demanded transparency about what really happened. The unresolved questions surrounding his death only magnified outrage when Broadview erupted. For many protesters, the tear gas was not a one-time event, but part of a pattern of excessive force against immigrant communities. Adding fuel to the controversy was the presence of Gregory Bovino, Customs and Border Protection Chief, who had overseen previous immigration sweeps in Los Angeles. Bovino was filmed at Broadview, flanked by heavily armed officers, surveying the scene. Days earlier, he had posted on social media announcing his arrival in Chicago. "Operation at Large has landed," he wrote, declaring the mission was to make the city safer by targeting criminal aliens. For critics, his words confirmed their fears. Broadview was not just a routine enforcement action, but a staged show of power, meant to intimidate immigrant communities and impress political leadership in Washington. By evening, Illinois felt split in two. Supporters of the protest framed Broadview as a symbol of resistance against cruelty and secrecy. To them, the sight of tear gas rolling through a suburban street, choking families and clergy, was proof of government overreach. Meanwhile, DHS supporters argued that law enforcement was being unfairly demonized for doing its job. Television networks aired dueling soundbites, one of Amawala's tearful statement about chaos and another of DHS officials insisting order had to be restored. In Chicago's streets, Broadview became shorthand for a much bigger debate: who controls the narrative and whose version of justice the nation will accept. As the sun dipped lower, Broadview's streets bore the scars of confrontation. Protest signs were scattered across the pavement, some torn, others trampled. The grass around the ICE facility was burned in patches where tear gas canisters had hissed and rolled. A few families lingered at the edges, comforting children still coughing from chemical exposure. Volunteers continued handing out water and makeshift first aid supplies. Across the street, lines of federal officers stood in rigid formation, gas masks still hanging from their belts, as if waiting for the next wave. The protest itself had been dispersed, but the tension had not gone anywhere. Within hours, video clips of the clash spread across social media. One clip showed officers firing canisters as clergy members prayed in front of them. Another captured Bushra Amawala wiping her eyes and declaring that agents had created chaos. A third, recorded by NBC5 Chicago, showed tear gas rolling toward media trucks as reporters scrambled. These images ricocheted across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok, sparking outrage and debate. To some viewers, the protesters looked like defenders of democracy. To others, they looked like agitators disrupting law enforcement. The battle for public opinion was as fierce as the standoff on the ground. Civil rights organizations promised immediate legal action, accusing DHS of violating constitutional rights by attacking peaceful demonstrators. Lawyers spoke of filing injunctions to force independent oversight of ICE facilities in Illinois. Politicians, meanwhile, seized the moment. Governor Pritzker demanded federal hearings, while members of Congress from Illinois prepared letters calling for investigations. At the same time, DHS doubled down, announcing more arrests and hinting at expanded sweeps. The clash at Broadview had become not just a protest, but the beginning of a prolonged legal and political fight over the limits of federal immigration enforcement. Broadview's chaos could not be separated from the broader national operation. Only weeks earlier in Los Angeles, protests against immigration sweeps had ended in violent clashes after President Trump deployed the National Guard and Marines. Gregory Bovino, the same border protection chief now in Chicago, had overseen those actions as well. Critics saw Broadview as a continuation of those tactics, militarized immigration enforcement designed to send a message to immigrant communities nationwide. Supporters countered that the country was under siege from lawlessness and that order had to be maintained. The stage was set for more confrontations in more cities. By the end of the day, Broadview was no longer just a suburb outside Chicago. It had become a symbol in the national debate over immigration, protest rights, and the reach of federal power. For immigrant families, it was a reminder of their vulnerability. For activists, it was proof that peaceful resistance could not be ignored. For federal officials, it was a demonstration of strength in the face of opposition. The tear gas lingered in the air long after the crowds had left, a physical echo of a deeper conflict. Broadview was now etched into the story of America's struggle over identity, belonging, and democracy itself. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your most unbelievable story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.